Hello everyone, welcome to the 9th lecture of this massive open online course on Sociology of Development. We are in the 4th week of this course, and in the 4th week, as you can see, we are discussing modernization theory. And if you look at the way we have started the modernization theory, you will find that the first sociological account of development was the modernization theory, which postulates that the less developed economies would eventually catch up with the industrialized world, provided they emulated the economic and social systems of Western capitalism. That is what we have discussed in the last class. Modernization theory is the mainstream school of scholarship about poverty and economic, social and political developments in the countries of the third world. The proponents or the adherents of this approach, the adherents of the modernization theory do not actually see themselves as a cohesive school, rather they are more inclined to emphasize the disputes among them and to dismiss the dependency school, which we are going to cover in the 8th and 9th week of this course, and the Marxist development theory as irrelevant or excessively doctrinaire or political in nature. An important idea of the modernization theory is the concept of the traditional society. The proponents of modernization theory think of today's third world societies as being largely traditional. They also think of Western Europe as having been traditional in the long period before the era of modern economic growth and cultural change. I mean, they were they have been referring to, the proponents of modernization theory have been referring to the Industrial Revolution, the decline of the influence of church on the social and public life of the individual, of the community at large, rise of modernity, critical thinking, rationality and so on. The essence of a traditional society is that it is stagnant and unchanging. Its values are spiritual, not grounded in individual self-betterment. Its rhythms of life are circular, not linear and progressive. One always returns to the same place. The traditional world is emotionally comfortable, a world in which each person has a place that is secure, a place in the family among the pantheon of ancestors. The traditional person identifies with her or his ancestors and emulates them. Daily work is being carried out just as it always has been, not to secure a profit, but to perform one's duty to maintain one's place in the society, in our economy, in our culture, in our polity and so on. Nothing is innovative and there is no attempt to better one's lot. No distinction exists between daily life and spiritual life, it is all one. Almost any religious system can serve as the basis for a traditional society. And as we have discussed in the last class, modernization theory was based on structural functionalism. Structural functionalism postulates that society is composed on the basis of complementarity and reciprocity of roles in the social division of labor. And essentially, modernization theory or the theories of modernization, however, explicitly or implicitly are theories of capitalist development, that is premised upon the creation and maintenance of the basic structures and institutions of a capitalist society. As the modernization theory is largely based on the theoretical premises of structural functionalism, modernization theory conceptualized development as a staged transition from tradition to modernity to be brought about at 3 levels. One, at the economic level by the operations of the market and foreign investment. 2, at the social level by the adoption of appropriate Western institutions, values, behaviors and so on. And 3, at the political level by the implementation of parliamentary democracy. That is how we have discussed how Rostow provided his stages of growth, starting from traditional society to pre-takeoff to takeoff to drive to maturity and high mass consumption. Okay? And given the central role that was accorded to the state and public policy in modernization theory, and what we have discussed in the last class, that though the modernization theory accorded central role to the state and public policy, it failed to examine the nature of the state itself, its location within the matrix of a class divided society, and its relationship with contending social forces. If this is so, then the postulates of or the proponents of modernization theory suggest that the state is thought of an entity that stands outside and above society. It is thought of the state is thought of an autonomous agency that is invested potentially with an independent source of rationality, that is enriched by technical assistance from the developed world, and the state is thought of having the capability to initiate and pursue programs of development for the benefit of the whole of society. And if this is so, if the state is thought of an entity that stands outside and above society, then there is an implicit disjunction between the state and society, slurring over questions about the social foundations of political power and the making of public policy. The problematic of the state is then narrowed down to that of the efficacy of its public institutions and organs to achieve objectives and programs of modernization, focusing especially on the respective roles of ruling elites, dominant political parties, the bureaucracy and the military. That is how discourses on development, debates on development have conceptualized the state as making or as having made a transition from the four elements of the state, namely population, territory, government and sovereignty, to the state having been able to entertain the ruling elites, dominant political parties, the bureaucracy and the military. And then we have discussed how the state and society, the relationship between state and society in modernization theory in the context of functionalist theory, which has significant implications for political sociology and sociology of development and so on. And then we have discussed how theories of modernization, however explicitly or implicitly, are theories of capitalist development, in as much as they are premised on the creation and maintenance of the basic structures and institutions of a capitalist society, which may be contrasted with notions of revolutionary change that makes decisive break with the internal structures and the encompassing international framework of global capitalism. Okay? Notions of exploitation, oppression, domination and subordination and antagonism of class interests. The similarity between modernization theory or theory of capitalist development on the one hand and theory of socialist development on the other, the similarity lies in the fact that they always, both these theories of development, they aim at dissolution and transformation of pre-capitalist social and economic structures. The difference lies in their methods. Okay? When I say structures, social and economic structures, I tend to look at the political system, the state. An alternative view is that one that does not reify as a whole as functionalist theory does, but proceeds instead from the idea of the social process being constituted by interactions of free acting individuals. The market model nevertheless arrives at very similar conclusions to those of functionalist theory on issues of relevance here. And reification refers to the process where the result of our actions only appears to us as a quasi-natural thing or matter or object because we do not recognize its social origins or process of creation that goes into its formation. And then we have discussed how economic markets, political markets, they have also contributed to strengthening the premises of modernization theory. Economic markets in terms of free competition and structural imperatives, foreign direct investment and so on. And political markets, when I say, I mean political entrepreneurs aiming to maximize votes through legislation, the application of laws and authoritative allocations of value. Structural imperative that we have discussed yesterday, the imperative of capitalism, its imperative character lies in the fact that it determines the consequences of all such actions. It makes the new situations successively the basis on which fresh calculations are made and corrective action contemplated. Okay. Then we have discussed how there are different issues so far as the relationship between the state and development can be examined, the instrumental nature of the state, goal oriented nature of the state and so on we have discussed. Okay. Now, today what we are going to do, after having recapitulated what was discussed in the last class, okay, what we are going to do, we will consider presently the problem of rival interests between the dominant classes within peripheral capitalist societies. The concept of the structural imperative, if you look at this, if we have to understand this in this way in the context of peripheral capitalist societies, I mean capitalism which is being practiced, which is being pursued in the third world countries, in the developing economies, okay, it allows us to recognize the possibility of disjunction within limits and at particular moments between the making of public policy and the contending interests of the dominant classes, the indigenous bourgeois, the metropolitan bourgeois and landowning classes, as well as the fact that such deviations not only have limits, but cannot persist over a long period of time, for they are soon overtaken by the consequences of such policies which bring into play forces for an alteration of the course, so that state policies are brought into line with the requirements and demands of peripheral capitalism. Okay. If this is so, this view of the economic determination of in the last instance allows us to account for the stupidity and miscalculations of the guardians of the state and for the degree of freedom that they possess in possibly pursuing their own interests by virtue of being in charge of the state apparatus. Okay. I mean, if you look at this, the question of the plurality of dominant classes in peripheral capitalist societies, which is unlike that in advanced capitalist countries, where we have only one dominant class to contend with, a fact that which has shaped Marxist debates on the theory of the state in particular mold, one that does not easily fit the case of the peripheral capitalist societies. The problem of identifying the ruling classes and class alignments in peripheral capitalist societies is more complex than in advanced capitalist countries. To comprehend this problem, one must recall that for each mode of production, such as the feudal mode of production or the capitalist mode of production, Marxist theory recognizes pairs of fundamental classes. This is extremely important. Okay. What is that fundamental class? Now, the class of exploited producers, the exploiting class whose social relations of production are constitutive of that mode. Whereas, where capitalism has triumphed and dissolved pre-capitalist social and economic structures. As in the advanced capitalist countries, the bourgeois and the proletariat, I mean the exploiters and the exploited, I mean the capitalists and the working class, that is why the bourgeois and the proletariat are the fundamental classes. Whereas in non-colonized pre-revolutionary Russia, where when Tsar's rule was there, which Lenin analyzed, we have a social formation in which the feudal mode was still dominant, but the capitalist mode was rising and challenging that earlier mode. We have fundamental classes located in the respective modes in antagonistic contradiction. That is why fundamental classes are extremely important. The development of the one necessarily entailed the dissolution of the other. The interests of the two fundamental classes in two modes of production in the same social formation are irreconcilable. The contradiction between the two is resolved only by structural change. Besides the fundamental classes, Marxism also recognizes the existence of auxiliary classes. We will come to this point a little while later. Okay? Auxiliary classes, I mean the educated salaried class and so on. Okay, we will come. I mean what are those auxiliary classes? I mean auxiliary classes, you may refer to petty producers, okay, that is one. Maybe petty traders, maybe professional classes, what I mean by professional classes, I mean educated salaried middle classes in peripheral capitalist societies, okay, whose structural significance, okay, whose these auxiliary classes structural significance is derived from their location in relation to the dominant mode of production and their relationship to the fundamental classes, which are the rival contenders to be the ruling classes. In peripheral capitalist societies, nevertheless, we are presented with a pattern of class formation and class alignments. Okay? Class formation as well as class alignment, that is different from that of the advanced capitalist countries and that of Lenin's picture of non-colonized Russia awaiting its bourgeois revolution. The actual process of class formation and restructuration in Africa, Asia and Latin America is a consequence of the impact of colonial capitalism. In the case of Latin America, also of the pre-capitalist Iberian colonial conquest, and is quite varied in accordance with differences in their respective pre-capitalist social formations and differences in their encounters with colonialism and the manner of their subsumption under peripheral capitalism. I mean capitalism in the third world societies. For our present purposes, at the risk of some oversimplification, we may distinguish two basic types of situations. One is that of societies where we find well established landowning classes no longer feudal, but owners of capitalist landed property exploiting the labor of dispossessed peasants. With the establishment of the peripheral capitalist state and the institutions of a capitalist economy, we also find the growth of indigenous bourgeois at varying levels of development, including not only a comprador bourgeois that is ancillary to foreign capital, but also an industrial bourgeois whose relationship with foreign capital is ambivalent. Foreign capital opposes the development of this local rival, but at the same time, insofar as it does develop, certain sections of foreign capital, especially those engaged in high technology industries, will seek collaborative relationships with it. In addition, structural presence in post-colonial societies and their state apparatus, its hand is not removed with independence any more than it is absent in those countries that have not been subjected to direct colonial rule. In fact, the metropolitan bourgeois is represented in peripheral capitalist societies and the state doubly. It is represented in the first instance through its own local presence, organization and resources. But this direct presence is greatly reinforced through the mediation on its behalf of the respective metropolitan states in their dealings with states in peripheral capitalist societies, and therefore, it cannot be regarded as external to these societies. We find in peripheral capitalist societies where you will find capitalism being pursued or practiced, I mean in the third world societies that have a plurality of fundamental classes. We cannot, when I say plurality of fundamental classes, we cannot designate any one of them unambiguously as the ruling class. But the instrumentalist version of the Marxist theory of the state and the functionalist version as they are at present formulated are unable to offer a suitable theoretical framework in terms of which this problem can be resolved. Furthermore, unlike for example Lenin's model of pre-revolutionary Russia, these three classes are not located in antagonistic modes of production, okay, which would predicate an antagonistic contradiction between them, so that a rising class must triumph, bringing about the dissolution of the other two in a restructured society. Okay. It may be, there may be an argument that these are not three separate classes, but only fractions of a single class, okay, analogous to the division of the bourgeois in advanced capitalist countries into different fractions such as industrial capital 1, finance capital 2 and commercial capital 3. Okay. Industrial capital 1, finance capital 2 and commercial capital 3. Okay. But there is a fundamental difference between the two cases. In the advanced capitalist countries and on those lines in peripheral capitalism too, such fractions are essentially complementary in their functions, so that it is only by their coming together that capital as a whole is constituted in the overall organization of capitalist production and exchange. It is that essential underlying complementarity that constitutes them together into a single class, but that is by no means the case with respect to the indigenous bourgeois, the metropolitan bourgeois and the landowning classes in peripheral capitalist societies. Then indigenous bourgeois, metropolitan bourgeois and landowning classes in the third world societies where capitalism is being pursued or practiced. Each of these, I mean each of landowning class or industrial bourgeois or metropolitan bourgeois, each of these constitutes a whole class. In that sense, their roles are mutually exclusive rather than complementary. We cannot therefore think of them together as constituting a single ruling class. That is why classes are also fluid in nature. There is a sense of fluidity in the way through which we tend to conceptualize a class. Okay? Given that fact, neither the instrumentalist conception of the bourgeois state as thought of in the Marxist theory of the state in the context of advanced capitalist countries, not even less the functionalist Marxist theory can provide a satisfactory explanation of the basis of state power in peripheral capitalist societies. With a plurality of fundamental classes, we can therefore recognize the problematic of the state and class under peripheral capitalism as a distinct one. A second alternative that class configuration is found in some countries of Africa, where the indigenous population has consisted mainly of peasant communities. You can also look at India, peasant communities, I mean tribal societies, without large landowning classes such as those that we encounter in Asia, Latin America and other parts of Africa. In the wake of the colonial economic domination and transformation, expatriate bourgeois were implanted in these societies, not only representatives of the metropolitan bourgeois itself, but a comprador bourgeois recruited mainly from Asian countries to underpin the colonial economy. After decolonization, especially in the aftermath of the Second World War, with the summary expulsion or more subtle squeezing out of the Asians, a class vacuum was created. Inasmuch as theorists have failed to recognize the structural presence in these societies of the metropolitan bourgeois, they have been confronted with an apparently paradoxical picture of having only subordinate fundamental classes, that is working classes, but not a superordinate one that might be designated as the ruling class. In their search for a ruling class in that context, some Marxist theoreticians have turned to the new petty bourgeois, the salaried middle class drawn from the indigenous population that operates the state apparatus, and auxiliary class as the ruling class. Misconceived analysis grounded in such a view would disappear if we were to bring into the picture the role and structural presence of the metropolitan bourgeois in peripheral capitalist societies as a fundamental class. The political role of the educated salaried middle classes in peripheral capitalist societies is however very considerable, considerable importance, and should not be dismissed too easily by designating them as an auxiliary class. Okay? Especially in countries that have experienced direct colonial rule, that class has acquired special characteristics that distinguish it socially and culturally from other indigenous groups. It is extremely important. Their appropriation of an alien language and culture, English or French or anything, distances them from those in their society who lack the kind of education that they have had. They are subject to a far greater extent than any other class in peripheral capitalist societies to influences and ideas that emanate from the metropolitan countries, by virtue of the fact that they also hold the upper strata of the bureaucracy and the military. They hold a place of strategic importance, particularly for the metropolitan powers. Members of the educated salaried middle classes play an active and vigorous role in politics of peripheral capitalist societies, and much of the thrust of their political demands is directed toward positions of power in the state apparatus as such. The state is their biggest and the most remunerative employer, and given corruption and nepotism for their gain, we find a tendency for this class perpetually to fracture on the basis of ethnic, regional, linguistic, religious or sectarian loyalties, which on the surface may appear to contradict the traditions of the liberal secular Western ideologies, but they have imbibed In fact, they inhabit more than one cultural domain. Their lifestyle remains westernized, especially as expressed in material objects that fetishize Western culture. Their ideas, more importantly, are impregnated with the logic of capitalist rationality, even if, as in the case of modernist translations of their traditional culture and religion, they express such ideas in the idiom of tradition. A partial return to the indigenous culture can be an enriching but exotic experience for them, but their training in statecraft has a decidedly Western stamp. They have internalized the calculus of capital. They have a distinctive presence in peripheral capitalist societies and states, one that is qualitatively different from that of their counterparts in the advanced capitalist societies. A consideration of the classes from which the state apparatus is mainly recruited leads us to the third of the main questions we began with, namely the nature and character of the bureaucracy and the military. Of those who occupy positions of power and authority in the state, in a simple instrumentalist conception, their function is a purely derivative one, as the term implies. Equally so in the functionalist Marxist view, such as that propounded by Polangers, for whom the specificity of the bureaucracy is dissolved within a conception of the functions of the bourgeois. The issue is pursued there with reference to the class origins of the bureaucracy. Okay? This is important. When I say class origins of the bureaucracy that are considered to be of no significance, but what Hamza Alawi, Theodor Sanin, eminent sociologists of development, and eminent scholars of development studies, what they are of the opinion that they do not want to dismiss the significance of class origins as readily. Members of the higher strata of the bureaucracy and the military are often recruited from landowning or rich farmer families or the bourgeois who can afford to give them the required higher education. It is not surprising therefore, that despite commitments in some cases at the highest levels to programs such as land reform, these have failed to be implemented effectively for the class that is affected is directly represented within the state apparatus by virtue of the class origins of its officials, and is able thereby to undermine the implementation of measures directed against itself. Likewise, we encounter cases of class affiliation. Okay? Irrespective of their class origins, of officials who acquire close links with either the metropolitan bourgeois or the local bourgeois, whose interests they pursue vigorously and usually effectively. These are both aspects of the mode of class representation in the state. The problem of the nature and character of the state bureaucracy that we need to consider further relates not to the modes of class representation, but to whether the state as such establishes interests in society quite independent of the respective classes, and if so, what such interests can be, and what are the limits within which they may be pursued, subject to the structural imperatives that we have already discussed. Structural imperatives of peripheral capitalism. We can begin by recognizing that there is an almost universal tendency on the part of regimes in peripheral capitalist societies to acquire an authoritarian character and proliferate military dictatorships. This phenomenon is too often explained away by suggesting that it is a response to class struggles waged by workers and peasants, but such an explanation, which possibly true in some cases, most notoriously of course in the case of Chile, that we are going to discuss in the context of dependency theory in the 8th and 9th week of this course, is by no means true of the majority of such cases where movements among and the organization of subordinate classes are in fact quite weak, and actual resistance, if there is any, is sporadic and localized. One would not wish to minimize the repressive character of the state in peripheral capitalist societies in relation to the subordinate classes, and the effective intervention of the state through legislation and administrative means, as well as through the institutionalized violence of police and military action to suppress attempts on the part of the subordinate classes to organize themselves and to act in their own behalf. And the ideological apparatus of the state, I am using Althusser's term ideological state apparatus and so on. The ideological state apparatus as well as that deployed by the dominant classes is also preoccupied with the task of containing the thrust from below. But this explanation appears to be insufficient, inadequate when confronting the realities of many countries where highly centralized and undemocratic regimes have appeared. At a totally different level, nevertheless, we find that it is not the subordinate classes alone that confront the state as an alien force. The fundamental classes also have to do the same, and here it is mainly the administrative arm of the state that is deployed against them, even while upholding their fundamental interests. Unlike in the advanced capitalist countries, where the state has developed in the wake of a single dominant class, and state institutions and power have developed largely in keeping with the requirements of that class and are therefore subordinate to it, we find that in peripheral capitalist countries there is instead of very considerable accretion of powers of control and regulation over the dominant fundamental classes in the hands of a powerful and centralized state. Here the fundamental classes do not have any direct control over the state. Okay? Now, the fundamental classes do not have a direct control of the state. I mean, what is this syndrome look like? I mean, as the overdeveloped state, in the sense that the excessive enlargement of powers of control and regulation that the state has accumulated and elaborated extend far beyond the logic of what may be necessary for the orderly functioning of the social institutions of the society over the state presides. Referring to a society where there is more than one fundamental class, let us examine this relatively autonomous development of the state and its extensive power by virtue of the fact that precisely because of the plurality of the dominant classes whose rival interests are mediated by the state, which therefore sits in judgment over their respective demands, the state must enjoy a degree of freedom in relation to each of them individually. In opting for the interests of one class, the state by definition acts against the rival claim. It is therefore not an instrument of any one of them, nor can we in this case meaningfully take recourse to the functionalist Marxist formula of the state as the reproducer of the social order that upholds the ruling class as a whole. Okay? That ruling class as a whole. The plurality of classes that we are concerned with in the present context does not constitute a single class, and the functionalist formula too therefore makes little sense in that context. It would not be difficult to document instances where the state in peripheral capitalist societies has failed to pursue consistently the interests of any single one of the three dominant classes, including the metropolitan bourgeois, the most powerful of three for even metropolitan capital, and the metropolitan state on its behalf must now negotiate with the state. It cannot impose policies on these states, although it must be added that the degree of autonomy varies greatly. But crude statements of dependency are generally misleading and obscure the fact that metropolitan capital, of which there are several competing ones, often has to accept disappointments or compromises. Its relationship with the post-colonial state is no longer like that of the period of colonial rule, whether the direct or the indirect variety. Its relationship with the post-colonial state is no longer like that of the period of colonial rule, whether the direct or the indirect way, and this occurs even in societies where metropolitan capital is not confronted with competing indigenous fundamental classes. There are many factors that underlie this new equation of interstate relationships and the relatively greater degree of freedom of peripheral capitalist states following the end of colonialism, following decolonization. Issues that we cannot pursue here in this lecture, perhaps for this course also. But on the contrary, what we find, we must recognize the very considerable economic dependence of peripheral capitalist societies on metropolitan capital. The question that we must return to is that of the purposes for which this relative autonomy of the state and those at the head of it is deployed. Their relative autonomy places unprecedented opportunities for profit at their disposal. These arise in two ways. One, states under peripheral capitalism deploy in the name of development vast economic resources, often considerably exceeding the amount of private investment, and such resources are drawn in part from a proportion of the surplus value currently generated within the economy, but this is multiplied by resources drawn by borrowing from abroad, and this scale of public expenditure establishes an independent economic base and vested interest for those in command of the state, so that state expenditures and programs cannot always be rationalized and justified by reference to the needs and requirements of the economy and the dominant fundamental classes. And demands for state expenditure and the manner of their disbursement are influenced not only by the private benefits those who are in charge of the program derive from them. In part, they are influenced also by the collective demands of the sections of the state apparatus, most notoriously the military, which has a vested interest in channeling public funds into projects that sever its interests, often to the detriment of the economy as a whole and therefore of the fundamental classes, which are thereby deprived of resources. Associated with this direct appropriation and use of economic resources, we find the deployment of state power itself in relation to the fundamental classes by way of proliferation of state controls that create a series of hurdles, obstacles, barriers that potential investors must overcome, and that they do by bribing state officials at all levels. And this opens up another channel by which those in command of the state apparatus siphon off a part of the surplus for their own private gain. But both these ways of deploying state power and its command over economic resources can operate only within the continued and unimpaired framework of peripheral capitalism itself. It is within this framework that private gains can be enjoyed. Even more, the enrichment of public officials, politicians, bureaucrats and the military officers bears its best fruit when they can invest their ill-gotten gains, and for that they must again operate within the framework of peripheral capitalism. In so far as this guarantees the commitment of the guardians of the state to maintaining the structure of peripheral capitalism, the loss of a proportion of the surplus is a price that the fundamental classes pay for the ultimate preservation of their own collective interests. And finally, it must be I must point out that the management of the state and the economy as a whole is itself subject to the structural imperative. In the final analysis, therefore, state policies must remain within the framework and logic of peripheral capitalism. Otherwise, those in command of the state would find themselves in the grip of crisis that they cannot resolve. In order to maintain this relative autonomy in relation to the dominant classes, not to speak of the subordinate classes, state authorities in peripheral capitalist societies try to prevent the creation and functioning of effective representative political institutions through which these classes can mobilize to bring pressure to bear upon the state authorities. Even where they nominally exist, parliamentary institutions and political parties atrophy and effective power gravitates into the hands of those who are at the head of the state apparatus, and the bureaucracy and the military rather than the political parties are their main source of power. India is often cited as the India used to be cited as an exception, a genuine parliamentary democracy in a peripheral capitalist society. But a close examination of the Indian political system today in 2021 shows that the control of the bureaucracy by those at the head of the government has played a far greater role as the basis of state power, including the management of factions within the ruling party itself, than is generally and superficially acknowledged. Elsewhere, the power of the bureaucracy and military is far more blatant. Military rule is all too often believed to be merely an instance of intensified repression. There are of course many instances where the military is brought into power precisely for that purpose. But such a view of the role of the military in peripheral capitalist states obscures three of its crucial aspects. First, civilian and parliamentary regimes by no means preclude a full deployment of the military against struggles and movements of subordinate classes. We may we can still go ahead with Indian example, where despite an elected parliamentary government, extreme repression has been used and the military fully deployed for that purpose. In fact, the simple equation of military rule with the unleashing of repression obscures its other equally important aspects. One is its juridical significance. It is not just that military rule makes possible the use of a greater amount of physical violence against the people, but that martial law supersedes all constitutional and legal constraints. It makes possible arbitrary rule not only with regard to repressive actions, but also with regard to administrative ones. The military puts itself forward as a law unto itself, needing no other source of authority. And another aspect is ideological. Here and there are several historical cases where this has been of central importance. the military genuinely enjoys a greater a degree of legitimacy among the common people and puts itself forward as the guardian of the integrity of the state. Until, if you look at what Hamza Alawi and Theodore Sanin are going for, until 1971, this was the case in Pakistan, where the military stepped into the political arena at times of political crisis, claiming to rescue the state from self-seeking politicians. Until its total loss of credibility, the military possessed sufficient charisma to enable it to do this. Similarly, we can cite the example of Turkey, where the military has also laid claim with some effect to the legacy of the nationalist struggle under the leadership of Kemal Ataturk, and by virtue of that claim has been able to step into the political arena with some force of political legitimacy as an ideological force, therefore, and not merely by virtue of its repressive power. And such resources of legitimacy are expendable, however, and are quickly dissipated when people see the real face of the military in power. And recognizing this, the more sophisticated among military leaders often prefer to keep a civilian government nominally in office, as long as they themselves hold effective power in the background. But ambitious military commanders do not always allow such considerations to stand in their way, and civilian political regimes all too often prove fragile. The question of legitimacy, in fact, is a crucial aspect of any state, for in the long run a state is not viable if it must resort to constant violence against the people. An ideological force is needed. Although the bureaucracy in most peripheral capitalist societies is at the core of state power, in as much as it shapes its day-to-day actions, and it is generally unable to legitimize itself and rule in its own name. The role of dominant political parties and variously elected parliamentary assemblies is to provide such legitimacy, but elections open the way for forces from civil society to imagine themselves upon the state to some degree. Where this has led to a crisis, you will find that military solutions have been sought. Government by political parties does not, however, necessitate genuine elections or mass mobilization. See, mobilization and participation, they are crucial political indicators of development, but you will find that government by political parties does not, however, necessitate genuine elections or mass mobilization. It is often the case, especially in one party systems, that and also in multi party systems, where one political party becomes very dominant, okay, especially through coercive power, that the ruling party is an empty shell buttressed by the bureaucracy, which not only sees no need to mobilize mass support, but fears it. One fourth major question was whether we must view the state only as an entity, one that exists and acts in a variety of ways for and on behalf of ruling classes, or whether we can combine that view with a view of the state as a set of institutions that constitute as an arena of class struggle. Okay. We suggest that both these aspects of the state are necessary to arrive at an adequate conception of the state. In as much of the preceding discussion, we have in fact referred to the struggle among three contending fundamental classes, which seek various forms of representation in the state and vie with each other to direct the formulation and implementation of public policy along lines that serve their particular class interests. By that token, We have looked upon the state as an arena of class struggle among rival fundamental classes. Likewise, you will find that within much narrower limits, subordinate classes may also find it possible to establish positions within the political system and the state and achieve a degree of class representation in order to achieve some limited gains. Such policies can exist in conditions of electoral politics, where rival parties need to rally some degree of mass support, but the possibilities of such gains you will find by subordinate classes is necessarily limited by the structural imperatives of peripheral capitalism. We may distinguish certain primary conditions which follow from the structural imperative and concern the very foundations of the social order of peripheral capitalism. On those, there can be no compromise and the state will not yield, and on the other hand, it is also possible to conceive of other areas in which there is scope for compromise and where concessions can be made in the face of mass struggles, concessions which will blunt the thrust of mass movements. And for the fundamental classes that we have been discussing, fundamental classes, if you look at this, okay, I mean the class of exploited producers, the exploited class whose social relations of production are constitutive of that mode of production, okay, hopefully aid in the orderly incorporation of the subordinate classes into the framework of state power of peripheral capitalism. But that power itself and its social base is not transcended. That can only happen if there is a revolutionary rupture and a dissolution of the peripheral capitalist state along with peripheral capitalism itself. Okay? Then what we have discussed today? We have discussed, if you look at this, we have discussed structural imperative to recognize the possibility of disjunction within limits and at particular movements between between the making of public policy and the contending interests of the dominant classes, the indigenous bourgeois, the metropolitan bourgeois and landowning classes, as well as the fact that such deviations not only have limits but cannot persist over a long period of time, for they are soon overtaken by the consequences of such policies, which bring into play forces for an alteration of the course, so that state policies are brought into line with the requirements and demands of peripheral capitalism. Then we have discussed how such view of the economic determination in the last instance allows us to account for the stupidity and miscalculations of the guardians of the state and for the degree of freedom that they possess in possibly pursuing their own interests by virtue of being in charge of the state apparatus. The question of the plurality of the dominant classes in peripheral capitalist societies, which is unlike that in advanced capitalist societies, advanced capitalist countries, where we have only one dominant class to contend with, a fact which has shaped Marxist debates on the theory of the state in particular mold, one that does not easily fit the case of the peripheral capitalist societies. Then we have discussed how the problem of identifying the ruling classes and class alignments in peripheral capitalist societies is more complex than in advanced capitalist countries. And then we have discussed the nature of the fundamental classes that constitutes the class of exploited producers and the exploiting class, whose social relations are constitutive of that specific mode of production. Then we have discussed class formation and class alignments. We have also discussed fractions of a single class analogous to the division of the bourgeois in advanced capitalist countries into different fractions in three forms of capital, namely industrial capital, finance capital and commercial capital. And then we have discussed the auxiliary classes, but the political role of the educated salaried middle classes in peripheral capitalist societies is very often referred to as auxiliary classes, which is not correct. Okay. Then we have discussed class origins of the bureaucracy and the nature of the state in peripheral capitalist societies, and India is no exception to this. We are trying to look at not simply India in this context, we are trying to look at three important, very important continents, namely Asia, Africa and Latin America, precisely because of the long history of colonization that we have suffered for centuries, and how modernization theory is trying to strengthen the grip of colonialism in these three continents. And in the next class, what we are going to do, we are going to look at modernization theory from the perspective of more and more developing economies, developing societies and so on. And after having completed this week, then we'll go ahead with only Theodore Sanin's empirical peasantry and hypothetical proletariat and so on. Thank you.